This is the lecture for our first debates on your constructive speeches. Those will be your first speeches that you write, and build. They're called constructive because they like build your case. There's a video for next week that you should watch about building your constructive, and before you write your speech. Also, be sure to check out the grading rubric for the debates that I've posted online. Um, but for right now, for this week, since we're reading these chapters, I wanted to go over the possible cases that I found in the readings. So as you're doing your blogs and your briefs and your research, you're making sure that you match up your research to one of these cases. And I want to reiterate, I want you to pick one of the cases that are listed here, whether you're affirmative or negative, uh, because that way we all know kind of in advance what the potential arguments are. Um, and that way, we uh, aren't just going off on a tangent that wasn't something based in something that we read. So pick one of the cases and develop it. Um, so just a brief note on cases. Remember, our topic is digital media are net beneficial for society. Um, Society, when we're talking about society, I think the book does a good job of explaining it, but these are things that sort of affect us all in common or affect us all collectively, right? Um, how do I move this? Sorry if my mouth is covered up. I don't know how to get rid of that little movie recording thing. Oh, there it goes. Anyway, um, so, if you're affirmative, you're saying, yes, there are advantages of digital media for society. If you're negative, you're going to argue disadvantages of digital media for society. I recommend that since these are short speeches, that you pick just one of these and develop it in depth with like 4 or 5 or maybe more supporting subpoints and supporting briefs. Um, you could do two potentially, but I find that if it's a 5 minute speech or 6 minute speech, if you do two, then you're only spending like 3 minutes on each one, and then in that point, um, you know, you'll be surprised how fast 3 minutes goes. You won't have a whole lot of subpoints and supporting points. So the goal is to kind of go deeper and develop these arguments, right? The Lindgren book is just kind of giving you the bare bones of some arguments that are out there, some advantages and disadvantages, and it's your job to sort of develop them, put the skin and the muscle and all of that on the skeleton that Lindgren has given to us. Okay, so um, the first advantage, the networked public advantage. This is mostly in chapter 2 of Lindgren, and it's about just how much bigger our networks are now and how much more accessible our networks are now. And think of all the things that you gain from these networks, right? Like job opportunities, hobbies, interests, different DIY groups, um, you know, uh, uh, and on, right? Just support, emotional support. Um, you know, uh, we crowdsource. I got an issue, and I'm wondering if anybody out there knows how to do it, or I wonder if anybody knows a mechanic, or I wonder if anybody knows a good carpenter or whatever. And those networks provide us with information and resources and support. And outlets for entertainment and outlets for job opportunities and to learn and grow ourselves and such like that. We have bigger networks of friends, we have networks of interest, networks of hobbies, work networks, and on and on. Um, Now, the one thing about this advantage, and there's one coming up called networked individualism that's difficult maybe to research, is that if you just type in network and try to do a search on that, you're going to get so many articles. You're going to get articles on social networks. You're going to get articles, like social media networks. You're going to get articles on just like social networks more generally, and whatnot. So, I recommend like maybe doing like the internet and networks or social media and networks as a source, as a search. And also the authors that Lindgren cites, the ones named Barbasi is a big one. And there's another one that he doesn't mention named Alex Pentland, Pentland. Um, And they're like, big into kind of the network theory and why networks are important and stuff like that. So if you do a search for network and Barbary or network and Pentland, then anything you find that's using them is likely to be talking about kind of the advantages of networks. Um, Similar argument, networked individualism, with a little bit of a spin. This is in chapter 2 and at the end of chapter 3, and it all comes from these authors, Rainey and Wellman. I think you can find some of their work online pretty accessibly. Uh, and they argue that what's unique about digital networks is that they're networks, and we've always had social networks and stuff, um, but it's kind of it also allows the individual to kind of craft and choose their networks. So it's not a group or an old school kind of social network, but it's also not just strict individualism. It's sort of the best of both worlds. You get the possibility to have bigger networks while still kind of remaining in control and having choice and autonomy over which networks you get. So again, all the advantages of networks apply here. We get more resources, more support, more information, more opportunities. But we also get the ability to express ourselves, the ability to curate our own lives in a sense, as well as pick and choose what we want to be public and what we want to remain more private, for instance. Related to this, but a little different, is the next advantage, the community advantage. This mostly comes from chapter 5 in Lindgren. Community is a little different than a network. If you think of like your school network, it might be composed of like everybody that you met while you're here at UC, or your job network might be, people in your field that you know and that you have connections with. But community is kind of more intimate and a deeper connection. A community might be, traditionally it was sort of like your neighborhood or something like that. It might be your sports team. It might be your church. But there's a lot of ways now to form virtual communities. New ways to find and connect with people. Whether you think about like support groups online. There are support groups for all kinds of different mental health and trauma issues. There are support groups for LGBTQ people, etc. And sometimes we get a community out of those people and those connections that we make. There are fan fiction communities. There are gaming communities, right? On and on. Hobbies, interests. And the important thing about these types of communities and why digital media makes them better is that they're easier to access and they're not limited by space, right? That is, they don't have to be people in your own town or in your own neighborhood to form a community with. Instead, they can be driven by shared passion or shared interest instead. Right, so we get to kind of pick and choose our communities a little bit more. We get to pick what we want to form our communities around. The book talks about them as sort of new third places. The first place was your home, the second place was your workplace, and a third place would have been like, a book club or something like that, a bowling league. But now we can find those online, and they're more accessible, and in some ways can be better online because of more people can connect across space and time. They come with new norms and structures. Like every communities have organizations. They have norms that they come with about how we interact and whatnot. There's a lot of advantages to community. I think especially related to like happiness and mental health and stress and things like that, self-expression. So when you're arguing these advantages, don't forget to include the impact at the end of the advantage. Like the impact is sort of the so what or why does this matter question, right? So why is community important? And you might have to do a little extra research to find a good quote on that, or do some elaboration of your own analysis about why you think community makes for better lives for all of us. The next is like called the public sphere advantage. This comes mostly in chapter 9, but also a little bit in chapter 2. And it's the public sphere because it's about things that affect the public. So it's a sort of a political advantage. It comes from uh, this guy Jürgen Habermas, who did a study about kind of the emergence of democracy. And what he found was that kind of in the 17th century in Europe, and then eventually in kind of like the 18th century in America and stuff, what was happening was there was an emerging middle class that had enough like money and free time to engage in like leisure activities. And so what popped up were like coffee shops and these things called salons, which were not like haircutting places, but basically like places that people would go to do book clubs or have conversations or stuff like that. And so as this middle class sort of had that leisure time and they were starting to gather in these places, they would start to talk about politics. And as they talked about politics, they started to see themselves as a public, right? We have a shared interest as a group of people, and and then from there they started pressuring their government to pay attention. Their governments, which at the times were all kings, uh, to pay attention to their concerns and their interest, and that's what eventually led to democracy. And there's a lot of studies that say, a strong public sphere is really key to democracy, right? It's the thing that helps, public pressure and public awareness of issues is what helps keep our government representative and keep our government in check and such. Um, and what the internet does, obviously, is it enables multiple public spheres, right? And it gives us access to it. It makes it easier to find. You don't have to have the money and the free time that you can spend all your evenings at a salon or at a coffee shop in order to meet people and talk about politics that way. Instead, you can do it online now. We can pick publics and public spheres based on our own interests. If you're an environmentalist, you can find in a group of people that are talking about environmentalism online. And if you find, if you're into something else, you can find groups that are into that as well. Or maybe it's more like, like me, where it's just, occasionally like political news sort of pops up on my feed, and we end up talking, me and my friends end up talking about it. But there's something very valuable about that discussion itself, because it creates awareness, and it creates motivation amongst people to put pressure and keep their government in check and such. Um, One of the authors in the reading talks about them as cyber salons. And another author talks about how even like our private concerns end up becoming public or political, right? So I'm thinking about like support groups for women, for instance, who deal with maybe sexual harassment or sexism. And they start talking amongst themselves sort of as just emotional support, but then they start realizing that, this is a political issue, this is a public issue, and things like the Me Too movement kind of grow out of that. An author that you should note here, if you're looking for some sources, is Clay Shirky, Shirky. He has an article in Foreign Affairs from, it's a while back, maybe 2006 or something, but he talks about how the big advantage of digital media is creating these public spheres. And he argues that, that these kind of conversations and political awareness are absolutely essential to democracy, that they're more important than just having like a constitution and stuff like that, because the constitutions can be overturned and eroded. But if the public is pressuring their government and aware of what's going on, then it's harder to do that. Next advantage is an activism advantage. This is mostly in Chapter 9. There's lots of examples of activist groups emerging and using digital media these days. The Me Too movement was, wholly a virtual movement, because it was just people posting, "Hey, me too. I've been sexually harassed. Me too. I've, faced discrimination for being a woman." And that allowed, and that sharing, that sort of public airing of grievances, gave people the bravery to do that more and more. The digital media made it more accessible, made more people more comfortable doing that. There was the Occupy movement back in the early 2010s. Black Lives Matter is another, example recently. Manuel Castells is a key site that Lindgren uses, so I encourage you to try to find some stuff that he argues. But there's a lot of articles on the benefits for activism. It enables easier fundraising. easier ability to spread and create their own messages, uh, easier to coordinate events and get the word out, easier to organize at a speed and scale that we haven't seen before, right? When Trump was elected in January of the year after the election, there was a huge women's march all across the world. Millions of people participated in that march. And if you imagine, like before digital media, how long it would take to organize that many people to participate in a march. But with digital media, like one person shares the march on their page and that reaches 100 people, and another person, one of those 100 people, shares it and it reaches another 50 people, and on, and it just grows exponentially. So it can be much faster and much larger. Another issue related to activism, but a little bit different, is just citizen engagement. The internet makes citizen engagement easier. It makes it easier to contact our politicians. It makes it easier for us to remain aware of issues. It makes it easier for us to express our opinion on issues. It makes it easier, for us to engage in even something what's called citizen journalism. Now, this mostly comes from Chapter 9. There's the idea of the monitorial citizen. That is that because of social media and such, that we're kind of constantly aware of what's going on in our government, and we're monitoring them. And that monitoring kind of helps keep our governments in check. We also get new ways of campaigning, speaking directly to our politicians, new ways of like getting out the vote and voter drives. There's actually studies that show that, those things where you post on your social media that says, "Hey, I voted," that those actually increase voter turnout. There's a thing called citizen journalism, also discussed in this chapter. In the past, the only people who kind of wrote the news were people that worked for these big institutions and stuff, the New York Times or Fox News or something like that. Now anybody can kind of express their opinion. Anybody can do their own research. Anybody can craft an article based on that research. So citizens can engage in journalism, and what happens is we get more diverse perspectives and we get more points of view, which is always good for a democracy. And there's just evidence out there, studies that say that just talking about politics and seeing stories, even if you're not really into politics, makes people more engaged and aware. There's a concept called ambient awareness. That is, it's sort of just in the air, and we hear about it because our friends are talking about it or whatever. And that actually makes us all kind of into better citizens. Everyone kind of gets a voice. There's this idea that digital media is sort of an equalizer that way. All right, now on to the negative arguments. The first one is the digital divide disadvantage. That comes in Chapter 8. The digital divide talks about how, that some people kind of have access to all these benefits while other people are left behind. The first level digital divide is just essentially access, right? Do you have high-speed internet? Do you have a computer at home? This one kind of breaks down along class lines. People in the first world have more access than people in the third world. Rich people have more access than poor people. But then scholars have also talked about a second level digital divide, and that has less to do with access, and it has more to do with skills and time. So maybe you have high-speed internet and a computer at home, but you're having to work 2 jobs to keep your family afloat. So you don't have time to get on and engage in all these great things online. Or maybe you don't have the skills, right? You lack sort of media literacy. You don't know how to do searches very well. That kind of thing can be a digital divide as well. And what happens because of this digital divide is it tends to kind of reinforce the same powerful voices. So people that already have the most money and the most time to spend on these things benefit the most from digital media. Their voices tend to dominate online. And because of that, kind of power doesn't change. In fact, the powerful get even more powerful. There's something in the book that talks about digital divide at the technical level. That's sort of just access, and do you have high-speed internet, et cetera. There's a skill-based digital divide, and there's a social support aspect of digital divide. If you're LGBTQ, or if you're a woman and you get online, you're much more likely to face harassment from trolls and bullies and stuff. So that tends to silence people. People don't offer their opinions because they're afraid of that bullying, and that creates a digital divide as well. So not only do we get just more rich and powerful voices, but we also get more male voices, more hetero voices, etc. Um, Closely related, and you could kind of combine the digital divide with this disadvantages. What I'm calling like it reinforces power disadvantage that comes from chapter 8 mostly. And some studies that show that there's a thing called the Matthew effect online. It comes from a verse in the book of Matthew in the Bible that just basically says the rich get richer. Um, and studies have been shown that like all of the top YouTube videos are kind of controlled by big corporate or owned by big corporations. The major music that you listen to on Spotify is controlled by big corporations, right? So while like the indie band gets access to Spotify and can put their music on there, um, what ends up happening actually is more listens go to the big stuff in the first place. Uh, and it's called a power law also, as well as the Matthew effect. That is that sort of these dominant hubs end up being sort of the main things that people click on and the main things that people pay attention to. There's also this concept of preferential attachment, the idea that a post that already has many views is likely to get many more views, and a post that has very few views is unlikely to ever get more views. That's because of the way algorithms work, right? Algorithms try to show you stuff based on what they think you're going to engage with. And since a bunch of other people have already engaged with this stuff, then they're more likely to show you these things. And so it just ends up reinforcing, again, white, male, and wealthy voices, right? Those people that already are rich, that already have power, that are already in the dominant position in society, get more clicks because they already had attention, because they already were their voice was already respected and stuff. There's a great source for this, a person named Astra Taylor. She wrote a book called The People's Platform, and maybe you can find some articles if you don't have time to get the book where she's talking about this. But there's some great statistics on this and the way that, the powerful gain even more power. You think about like, yeah, I can get my message out there, but, British Petroleum or ExxonMobil has a huge marketing budget. And so if I can get my message out there, imagine how much more they can get their message out there, right? There's also this danger of the most charismatic voices winning out, even if they're not, the most intelligent or the most insightful. We've seen that recently with charismatic leaders all around the world, like Bolsonaro in Brazil, Donald Trump here, certain media figures you might think of, like Tucker Carlson or Ben Shapiro, who are charismatic, even Joe Rogan, right? Very charismatic, funny, whatever. But, should we really be taking our political insight from high school dropouts and comedians? Maybe not so much. The next disadvantage is the political economy disadvantage. This comes mostly from chapter 8. And this is basically about how digital media affect the economy. And the first thing it is like exploited and enslaved workers, literally enslaved, like in places like the Congo, in order to like mine the cobalt and the other minerals we need for our batteries, for our smartphones, and for computers and whatnot. There are literally people that are enslaved for those things. There's also exploited workers, workers in call centers and other menial jobs in factories building these things that are, being not paid a fair wage in order to make these devices. There's also arguments out there, and I'll give you another author named Jaron, Jaron Lanier, Lanier. And he talks about how these like big companies like Apple and Google and Facebook end up kind of becoming these monopolies, right? Google like owns all search and basically all like advertising online. And the reason for that is similar to the Matthew effect, right? Like as more and more people go to Google to do searches or go to Google to use, their ad click service, or go to Facebook and use their ad service, then because there's people there, there's an incentive for you to go there and use it as well, right? Because you're trying to reach people. And so what ends up happening is we get these monopolies. Lanier calls them siren servers, uh, and and they squeeze out competition. They squeeze out the little guy. It's a big reason why prices keep going up dramatically because there is no competition. Um, so it ends up celebrating and reinforcing sort of monopoly capitalism. There's also an argument in the chapter about how we're all sort of exploited, because how Facebook works and how other social media works is you work for free for them. You create the content that they make the money off of, right? And we don't get anything from it other than like pleasure. Sometimes, sometimes we get stress and stuff. Um, so, there's an argument also that we're all kind of exploited because these companies are taking our free labor and making money off of it. I think AI and Chat GPT is a great example of this. How those things work is they basically just read thousands of websites and thousands of documents to train themselves. And then they give people answers, but they don't cite where they got those answers from. So they're taking free labor and making money off of it. So there's some exploitation there. There's potentially a race, gender, and class disadvantage, mostly coming from Chapter 8. This is the idea that like certain biases and stereotypes spread online and through digital media. If you think about like how men and women characters are portrayed in a lot of video games, for instance, they're very stereotypical. You think about like hate speech online. You think about like the formation of some of these communities that we talked about before that are based in racism or based in sexism. I'm thinking about like incels and the men's movement and white nationalist movements and stuff like that spread online. And it's worse online, both because it spreads easier and it's easier for the people to find one another, but also because of anonymity. You think about like trolls who maybe are using a fake profile or being anonymous, and also what's called the disinhibition effect. It's like when you're drunk, you're disinhibited. You might say things that you wouldn't say otherwise. The same thing happens online. When you're hiding behind a screen, you're more disinhibited. So things like racism and hate and bias and sexism is more likely to come out. If you haven't ever heard of the Gamergate controversy, you could look that up because it's a great example of how women face harassment online. There's a concept in the chapter about cyber types. It's basically how online stereotypes get sort of repurposed and stuff. And the idea here too about identity tourism. We can play as a black character, or we can play as a female character, or we can play as some identity that we're not. But oftentimes that play doesn't really like help us understand diversity. It just makes us feel like, see, I'm secure in my masculinity because I play as Lara Croft or whatever. But it doesn't actually, put us in the shoes of an actual woman, for instance. The next disadvantage is sort of related to the power disadvantage. Is called the authoritarian disadvantage. With this disadvantage, it's basically just that like kind of bad actors, like rich people and government agents, politicians, dictators, etc., can use digital media for their own ends as well. You think about Vladimir Putin and the misinformation and disinformation campaigns coming out of Russia. There's also the potential to survey like activist groups and crack down on them. That happened in Iran in what was called the Arab Spring, where they were like spying on people's Facebook. China does this as well. There's this thing called the Great Firewall of China and whatnot. And also sabotage those groups. Sometimes you can spread disinformation, spread fake videos, deep fakes, etc., in order to undermine these groups. While activist groups get new tools, so do the bad guys, in other words. And they get tools to spread their disinformation and their propaganda in ways that they didn't have before. A real good citation for this is an author named Evgeny Morozov. So if you look that up, you can probably find some good articles he's really answering the idea that digital media is going to help democracy. He's saying, no, it helps the bad guys as much as it does help democracy. And I think this is the last one. It's called the slacktivism disadvantage. This is sort of the opposite of the activism. Our book calls it clicktivism. Sometimes it's called slacktivism. Sometimes it's called clicktivism. So it's in chapter 2 some, and it's also some in chapter 9. It's not gone into great detail, but the idea here is that you know online we can like click and sign a petition real quick, or we can change like our Facebook profile or something, or a profile picture to say I support LGBTQ people, or I'm Black Lives Matter or something like that. But that's not real activism. It's sort of slacker activism, or it's just clicking some buttons, right? You maybe have heard the phrase like keyboard warriors or whatever. The real activism requires like a deep level of motivation and a deep level of commitment, and doing this stuff online doesn't do that, and it actually kind of lulls us into a false sense of security or a false sense of doing something. So we get this illusion of change instead of any real change. Another problem that people talk about in these that make these slacktivism arguments is that a lot of these movements don't have real leaders, and without sort of like a strong leadership, they eventually fizzle out. You think about like Black Lives Matter and all the protests that were happening during the George Floyd the summer when he was murdered and the case was going to trial and stuff. That was great and whatnot, but because they were sort of like decentralized and just spontaneous, they kind of fizzled out after that summer. And because of that, there was no one left to really pressure governments to actually make the changes. A key source here is a person named Malcolm Gladwell. He wrote an article called "The Revolution Will Not Be Tweeted," or "Why the Revolution Will Not Be Tweeted." It's a real good article. He makes these arguments, and it can help you build a really strong case. So those are all the possible advantages and disadvantages. And I encourage you again to pick one, maybe two of these, and really develop them with 4 to 5 briefs and subpoints. Try to diversify those arguments so that it becomes harder for your opponent to rebuttal them. And also, don't forget that why question. Why does it matter? So what? Tell us why community matters. Tell us why activism matters. Tell us why authoritarianism is a bad thing, or disinformation or propaganda are bad things, etc. All right. I hope you have a good rest of your week.